welcome back to the In Dreams Are Monsters season at the Birmingham Electric Cinema. It's our great pleasure to introduce film critic and author of Nightmare Movies, Kim Newman. Kim, welcome.
Hello, I'm very glad to be here virtually.
Well, we're delighted to virtually host you to discuss the 1974 release, The Beast Must Die. And just to start, how would you assess the film's contribution to werewolf cinema?
Oddly enough, I think its contribution to werewolf cinema is one of the lesser aspects of this extraordinary movie. It's one of the first films to present a werewolf who's kind of like the Hound of the Baskervilles, who's a dog made up rather than an actor under makeup. And I remember at the time, this was slightly disappointing. It's just a big dog. Actually, watching it again, it works pretty well, and the dog's fine. But it has the same issue that all versions of the Hound of the Baskervilles have. You have this big build-up as to how dangerous and evil and monstrous this creature is, and then just a big dog turns up at the end and is quite easily seen off. But I think there is so much else going on in this film that it's fascinating on all manner of other levels. But I like the werewolf. I've come to warm up to it.
As you say, a lot going on, and we're going to get under the bonnet of what's going on in this movie. Just thinking about the production context of this film, it's not only a werewolf film, it's an Amicus Studios film. And as we know, it stars Peter Cushing, and indeed Christopher Lee. We're in Amicus films, and they also employed the talents of Roy Ward Baker and Freddie Francis, also of Hammer. So I wonder, do you think Amicus were in any way under the shadow or in competition with the Hammer brand?
Oh, absolutely. It's like every single interview Milton Subotsky gave, he sort of raised the issue of a great rivalry with Hammer, and absolutely no interviews given by any of the Carreras family ever mention Amicus. In America, there used to be a rivalry between the two leading car rental firms. Hertz owned car rentals in America, and Avis had a slogan: is "We're number two, so we try harder." And Amicus went with that. They actually, the range of projects that they back is surprisingly large. When Hammer was sort of drawing in commercially and just making horror movies, sort of prehistoric babe pictures and TV sitcom spin-offs, Amicus got William Friedkin to make Harold Pinter's The Birthday Party. They made A Touch of Love. They made a bunch of musicals. They pioneered those Doug McClure versus Dinosaur movies from the 70s, which I think grow a bit out of The Beast Must Die. As a company, they're really interesting, and they very rarely did Hammer-type horror films. They made one or two period pictures. There's a Jekyll and Hyde movie called I, Monster, and now The Screaming Stars. But even they don't really look like Hammer films, although they've got a lot of the same personalities working there. Amicus's main sort of calling card was omnibus horror films like Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, Asylum, Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, From Beyond the Grave. And they had contemporary settings, which was very unlike Hammer's horror. They had lots and lots of stars, because if you're making short story films, you only need actors for a day or two. So you could afford Ralph Richardson to play the Crypt Keeper. And embarrassingly distinguished actors will come and do horrible things if it's only a day or two. And they hooked up with various other creatives. Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho, wrote a bunch of scripts for them, and they adapted a bunch of his stories. As I say, they did try and do different things. I think The Beast Must Die comes from that period of trying to do different things, which is what makes, I think, British horror so interesting in the early 1970s, is you get this you get kung fu vampire movies. You get extraordinary films like Deathline and Psychomania and The Corpse and Mumsy Nanny, Sonny and Girlie, just out of desperation, because basically the industry is collapsing and they're going to stop making these things in a few years. So they're all various companies and directors and filmmakers and writers are scrabbling around trying to find different things to do within the remit of the British horror film. It has to be said that at the time, none of these were enormously successful commercially. Although they came round, they washed their face in industry terms. I saw The Beast from Star on its first run on a double bill with Brian De Palma's Sisters, which was the support feature. And it struck me at the time as being unusual and interesting.
I think that's a fascinating answer, and in a way, it leads me on to my next question, but it's also prompted something else. I'm going to follow through the logic of where I'm going through. So the question I had for you, which I'm still going to ask, is that Amicus, if they were the number 2 on the car rentals, if they adopted that mantle, they're also the number 2 that largely got written out the horror film history, so the late scholar Peter Hutchins would often complain that because Max Rosenberg and Milton Subotsky were American, or they used American writers or comic traditions, they weren't seen as quote British. But interestingly, you're almost saying actually there's something intrinsically British about what Amicus
I think so. Even though, I mean, and Milton Subotsky kind of controversially was the key creator, because he was a producer and a writer, and unusually he loved this stuff. He was absolutely passionate about horror and science fiction and pulp. He'd been a fan all his life. He was the first respectable filmmaker, for instance, to try and buy the rights to Marvel comics. He wanted to do Spider-Man and Doctor Strange in the 60s, at which time he couldn't. But that said, that's a kind of a finger on the pulse of pop culture, rather more than You Got a Hammer, which at that time was rather staid. Even if you just look at the pop musicals they made, okay, they back It's Trad Dad, which on the one hand seemed to think that trad jazz was going to be the dominant musical form of the 1960s. But on the other hand, Subotsky hired Richard Lester to direct it, barely a year before A Hard Day's Night. So that's one miss and one amazing hit.
Incredible. I mean, I think they definitely have their finger of the pulse of pop culture, as you say. And I'm just sort of wondering what a young Kim Newman coming out that double bill thought of that film, but also just thinking that young Kim Newman would have been well aware of, like, coming out, maybe the lights weren't on because of strikes, maybe there's a 3-day week or hyperinflation. And the thing is, they seem to have their finger on the gritty pulse of 70s British politics and social concerns as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, certainly, most of the anthology movies seem to be much more directly involved with what's going on in Britain, even though, as I say, those that are drawn from Robert Bloch's stories, or those that are based on the EC horror comics, they take American stories, but they transfer them to a very interesting kind of grim suburban Britain. I mean, I think that they're all British films are about class. And something like From Beyond the Grave or Tales from the Crypt is shot through with points about the class system, and even stuff just about the interior decor of the 1970s. It's all there. I mean, one of the reasons the Hammer films have lasted is because they're period films. Sometimes they seem timeless, but the Amicus films are of their time, which maybe means that some modern viewers find it hard to get past the haircuts and that. However, that's sort of one of the things I really like about the movies, is the way they connect with a real world of the time.
I totally agree with you, and I love them for all those reasons. I mean, going back to the timelessness of Hammer, you know, it's fair to say that in '74, the werewolf vogue was pretty much dead. There were those few films that did continue to look at that figure were very much kind of period pieces. But
Yeah, the thing about werewolf films is they're more expensive than vampire movies. The effects are more complicated, they're more difficult. Every time there's a little boom in werewolf films, it's because new special effects techniques have been invented. That's why in the early 80s you had The Howling in American Werewolf in London and Cat People and The Beast Within and a bunch of other things, even The Thing, you know, that use transformation and change weird effects. And then there's another little blip later on when CGI comes in. I think the CGI werewolves work less well. But in the 70s, I mean, there were one or two other werewolf films around. Oddly, the most recent one then was a thing called The Boy Who Cried Werewolf. And if you look at the American poster for The Beast Must Die, it's got the monster from The Boy Who Cried Werewolf on it, because the monster from The Beast Must Die was considered insufficiently werewolf-like for a poster. A couple of years later, there's Peter Cushing was in a film called Legend of the Werewolf, but that was a bit of a throwback. There was The Werewolf of Washington was around that time, and The Werewolf of Woodstock. But you can see from those that it was becoming a form that people weren't taking terribly seriously. The werewolf was sort of more like Eddie Munster by this time, rather than Lon Chaney in The Wolf Man or Oliver Reed in Curse of the Werewolf. I think everybody was looking around, or people who made horror films were looking around trying to find ways of using the werewolf, of doing something interesting with the very tiny subgenre then of werewolf pictures. There were some TV ones as well, Moon of the Wolf and Death Moon.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. I mean, bringing this back to The Beast Must Die, you said earlier appropriately, it's much more than a werewolf film. So here we go. You know, what are the differing genre elements, and crucially, did they work?
The first thing is that Milton Subotsky was a science fiction fan. It's an adaptation of a British science fiction writer's short story. I have it here. James Blish's There Shall Be No Darkness, which I must have read in this very copy of the Fourth Mayflower Book of Black Magic Stories, edited by my late friend Michelle Parry, who actually wrote a film for Milton Subotsky, The Uncanny, which was based on an anthology of his called Beware the Cat. It's the story has sort of scientific rationalization for werewolves, which had been done in the 50s in things like I Was a Teenage Werewolf and The Werewolf. And the film tries that, but there's a lot of talk about lymph glands and wolfbane pollen and various other sort of practical stuff to do with werewolves, but it's still magic. I mean, the rules of werewolves in The Beast Must Die aren't particularly strong, and I get the impression that what was in the script is not matched by what's on the screen. But what to me is astonishing is that this is such a mashup of genres. And theoretically, it's an Agatha Christie style old dark house where a bunch of suspects get together for a weekend party hosted by somebody horrible. People die, and then you have to work out who the killer is. And it's also done with an array of horrible rich people from the 1970s in fabulous outfits. I have to say, I think Tom Chadbourne as the artist character, Paul Foote, is a style icon of mine. But a very young Michael Gambon is in it as a concert pianist in a safari suit, and he's pretty cool as well. But on top of that, it's an action movie, and horror films weren't generally action films in the 1970s. Hammer tried a bit with Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter, and Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires to sort of ramp up fighting vampires rather than just driving stakes through them. And The Beast Must Die has an exploding helicopter, it has machine guns, it has chases, it has that convention that's in Die Hard and in dozens of other action films of the guy running around with basically a phone in his ear and the man in the control room. In the recent Spider-Man films, there's a character who calls himself the guy in the chair. And Anton Diffring plays the guy in the chair in The Beast Must Die. And I actually can't think of many things beforehand that have that relationship that is now central to a particular style of action cinema. And that, to me, is fascinating. And then it becomes, by default, a black exploitation movie because it casts Calvin Lockhart, a very charismatic West Indian actor who'd worked in America and in Britain. It's actually accidental that he's in it. The part was written for Robert Quarry, who AIP had been building up as a horror star after the Count Yorga films, which is why he's in Madhouse and Dr. Phibes Rises Again and Sugar Hill, another blaxploitation picture. But he was rather limited as a screen star. He was also a bit middle-aged and pudgy. You couldn't see him running around or taking his shirt off or wearing the fetishist black leather outfits that Calvin Lockhart does. So he's out of it. But Lockhart inherits a role written for Quarry, who's good at playing supercilious, arrogant creeps. And it was really rare to have I can't think of another British horror film that has a black lead, even outside of tiny things like Naked Evil, which has a sort of voodoo milieu. But it's also a black lead who's really unsympathetic, because it's a character written for a white guy who usually plays heavies. And I think that Lockhart gives it it's a kind of complicated role. He's a guy who's actually sort of warm and funny and charming when dealing with his tech guy, but a complete bastard to his wife and his friends. And we get a tiny bit of backstory about how he's a self-made man. And also it's the stereotype that he's adhering to is what used to be called the great white hunter, but here he's a great black hunter. But it's interesting seeing a character who's presumably of African origin, who is a big game hunter, but he's a big game hunter in the European sense rather than in the any tribal or African cultural sense he might have, which makes him by accident a really interesting character culturally. Also, he is one of the coolest people in British films in that year. His look is great. The afro with a tinge of grey and the very stylized goatee and the terrific outfits. I mean, he's an all in black action hero. I think it's a shame that they weren't making Marvel Comics movies then, because he would have been great as Brother Voodoo, Marvel's voodoo character, who also has a Caribbean origin.
I think that's such a fascinating answer, and I think first of all, I think I agree with you. I think he does a brilliant job, and he brings a kind of intensity to it. And your response there has made me think, if I look back on Amicus, kind of unlike Hammer in a different way to Hammer, they were very open to explore cross-race themes, and there seemed to be a trope in Amicus films of white characters who are disrespectful of other people's culture and they get their just desserts. So I wonder, do you see kind of progressive elements here?
Yeah. It's probably something that Sapkowski picked up from EC Horror Comics. Actually, also, he wrote that episode of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors where Roy Castle steals the voodoo melody. And the thing is, that's a complete plagiarism of a story by Cornell Woolrich called Papa Benjamin. But it's one of those things. It's absolutely perfect. A couple of years ago, I was editing an anthology of horror and science fiction stories about music. And somebody sent in a story which accidentally was the same plot as Papa Benjamin, but about rap music, because white people are still stealing black music and deserve to be cursed for it. And so even though, again, I suppose it is that tiny little burst of interest in trad jazz is what makes Roy Castle the lead there. But I think that the kind of voodoo milieu that's in that, there's a bit of it in the Tomba episode of The Vault of Horror as well, is interesting and unusual. And it shows that Amicus were a bit more attuned to what was going on in the outside world. That said, Milton Subotsky was personally sometimes resistant to innovation. My good friend Christopher Wicking had many clashes with him over the script of Scream and Scream Again, which I think is one of their masterpieces, but Milton didn't like it very much.
That's fascinating stuff. And so, final question, and I feel I've got to return to young Kim Newman coming out of that screening. So the most controversial element of The Beast Must Die is obviously the werewolf break. Your thoughts on it? How did audiences respond?
They seemed to think it was fun. I have no problem with it. I think by that time I had seen the 1960s version of 10 Little Indians, which has the whodunit break, and frankly, the werewolf break is a complete copy of that. That's a Agatha Christie story made by Harry Iron Towers. It even has the ticking clock and all the suspects. It's like absolutely literary. One of the things I like about the werewolf break is it means that The Beast Must Die is introduced by the man in black. The voice of Valentine Dial, instantly recognizable. He had been the BBC's horror host in the 1940s on a show called Appointment with Fear, which was introduced by this character, the Man in Black, who was basically the crypt keeper. The Man in Black has been periodically revived. Valentine Dial kept playing him. He came back. There's a Hammer film called The Man in Black that he's in. There were a couple of revivals in the 70s. There was a revival called Fear on 4. And actually, a little more recently, there was a revival on BBC 4 Extra called The Man in Black with Mark Gatiss. I wrote an episode of that. But The Man in Black, and actually I saw The Beast Must Die with my dad. And my dad, in the 1940s, he had been a listener to Appointment with Fear. For the rest of his life, his idea of what was terrifying was Valentine Dial doing M.R. James's Whistle or I'll Come to You on the radio. That was the thing that gave him nightmares as a kid. And it was one of the things I suppose we bonded over a bit when I got interested in horror and the history of horror. But the fact that it's got that little thing, and you can hear Valentine Dial like narrating Hammer Films trailers. He does Mike Raven's voice in Lust for a Vampire as well. So he was officially the voice of British horror. And I think it's great that we got that. The problem with the werewolf break is The Beast Must Die does not play fair as a whodunit. Werewolves have no motive. They're just werewolves, right? So you can't put together the clues and work out who it is. It is just somebody at random is picked from the cast and is the culprit. I remember thinking that Tom Newcliffe, the Lockhart character, he's assembled a bunch of people who might be werewolves. There's nothing to say that they all aren't werewolves. And also, he's not a detective. He doesn't actually work out who the werewolf is. He just basically lets the werewolf kill as many people as possible until there's only one suspect standing. And you only find out who it is when he turns back. Although I think most people, realizing that everybody else had died, had worked it out. So I think that was kind of unfair. But it's an attempt to shoehorn werewolves into whodunits, which doesn't really work. It's the same with a lot of slasher movies that try to be whodunits, because slashers are serial killers. They're homicidal maniacs. They don't need a reason to kill people. And therefore, you can't use your little grey cells or your Holmesian deduction to work out who the guilty party is.
I think at the end of that, Kim, it's just made me conclude, and I'm sure we've got programmers from the Electric tuning in, that we need an Amicus season.
Well, absolutely. Yeah.
At the Birmingham Electric, definitely. But in the meantime...
don't forget to start with It's Trad Dad. Yeah.
That's a definite. That's a definite. In the meantime, it's been a real pleasure to host you in the In Dreams this season. Thank you so much, Kim Newman.
Thank you.